Well, I was going to say afternoon, but it's almost evening. So welcome to the final of today's 15 by 15 talks. I think the title is fairly self-explanatory by now. Some of you also look like you've been to other ones, so I don't know if I need to repeat this, but the speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and we will have 15 minutes of questions. There will be roving mics, people running around, mainly me, at this time of day, prodding you to ask questions in the last half of the session. There is also a second way to participate in the talks, which is through social media. If you're not already sitting on them, there should be a card which tells you roughly how to do that. But if you're on Twitter, then the hashtag to use is OECD4. We're in room number 4, so OECD4. And the other way is by Wissembly using the app. Please note, that if you write something, it will appear on the screen behind you. So it's not a feedback form to say, oh, I didn't like that talk, because it will appear right behind the person speaking as they speak live. So that can get really awkward. It does happen. So our next speaker is Mike Viking. He is going to speak about well-being, how we can measure happiness. He is the CEO of Happiness Research Institute, so that's appropriate, and research associate for Denmark at the World Database of Happiness. He's previously worked for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is the author of several books and reports on happiness and subjective well-being. He's going to be talking about, and I'm sure you noticed there are sofas in the main hall. And if you looked at the sign, that was all about, it's not just any sofas, a collection of sofas. It's about what looks like hygie, but it's pronounced hygge. Yeah, great, I got that kind of right. He's probably still crying inside. Which is I mean, I have ignored this trend as something I didn't want in my life, even though I think I try and live it anyway. So I'm totally ignorant. I'm going to let Mike take the stage and explain what it's all about. Thank you, Mike. Give him a round of applause.
Thanks, Siv. Your Danish is very good.
Thanks.
By the way.
Yeah.
Just on languages, a disclaimer. English is not my first language, and when I speak my second language, English, I know I get a really grumpy, stern look on my face, which is a real issue when you're a happiness researcher. I mean, in the threat of getting fired if I don't look happy. But basically, I want to talk about the work that we do at the Happiness Research Institute. I'm trying to click this one. Great. One back. Basically, our work in my career is trying to answer 3 simple questions. We're trying to figure out why or how do we measure happiness, why are some people happier than others, and how do we improve quality of life. And it's also what I'll try to cover in these 15 minutes. Of course, it's quite difficult questions. We haven't solved them all yet, but once we solve them, I can retire, but it's not going to be anytime soon. The first question: how do we measure happiness? I think the first thing we need to do when it comes to measuring happiness is acknowledge that it is an umbrella term, and that's whether we talk about happiness or well-being or quality of life. Sif had one idea of what happiness is. I might have another one. And what we need to do when we stumble upon these umbrella terms is that we need to tear them apart and look at the different elements or different components. It's also what we've done earlier today. We've been talking about the economy in different rooms. And with the economy, which is also an umbrella term, we break it down and look at the different components. So we've been talking about interest rates, we've been talking about inflation, we've been talking about unemployment, we've been talking about GDP. And every indicator gives us additional pieces of information of how the economy is doing. And we need to develop the same language when it comes to talking about and understanding happiness. Unfortunately, that is actually exactly what the OECD have done. I encourage all of you that are interested in a deep dive into happiness research to take a look at the report you see here, Guidelines on Measuring Wellbeing. They basically construct 3 dimensions of happiness or well-being that we need to capture in these surveys when we measure. The first one is life satisfaction. It's also called the cognitive dimension. And that is basically asking respondents to take a step back and evaluate our lives. It's a fairly stable measure. We report the same in the weekend as we do on Mondays. It's also the dimension that the Nordic countries do well on. I'll get back to that. The second dimension is called the affective dimension. And that is more about what kind of emotions we experience here and now, or yesterday. So if we take yesterday, did we feel happy, angry, sad, lonely, depressed? These two dimensions are of course linked. If you have an everyday with a lot of positive emotions, you probably also report higher levels of life satisfaction. But they're not completely overlapping. If we take happiness in the UK in 2016, can you guess what the unhappiest day in the UK was last year? Wasn't Brexit? Half the population thought that was a good idea. November? It was November 9th, the day we woke up and Donald Trump. We all felt bad. I even lost my computer on November 9th. It was a really bad morning. I didn't feel happy then, but I was still quite happy with my life overall. And that's why we need to separate those two dimensions. The third dimension we need to look at is based on what Aristotle thought the good life was. And to him, the good life was the meaningful life. So here we're looking at whether people have a sense of purpose. All of those dimensions are subjective. And some see that as an issue. I see that as a good thing. I think Sif is the best expert or judge to tell us whether he has a good life or not. And I think we also tend to forget that we try to understand and study a lot of other phenomena that are subjective by nature. Other people research depression, stress, anxiety, and at the end of the day, they're also about how we as individuals experience our life. We focused on the positive end of the scale, but I don't see any evidence that it should be more difficult to study happiness or well-being than depression or anxiety. What we also do when we study these things is we ideally follow people over time. When we follow people over time, we bypass some of the issues there are. For example, if we have different perceptions even of what life satisfaction is, or if we use scales differently, or if we have trouble understanding what is cause and what is effect in some of these measures. If we follow, for instance, you and the other 1,000 delegates here at the OECD over the next decade, we can start to see some changes in your life satisfaction. Some get married, some get divorced, some get promoted, some lose their jobs. And what I'm interested in understanding how those changes in your life circumstances affect these three dimensions. So that's how we try to measure happiness. Tear it apart, look at the different indicators. Say it's a good thing that we give some value to how people feel about their own lives and follow people over time. When we look at why some people are happier than others, we can look at the World Happiness Report. And there's 155 countries in that one. Usually the Nordic countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands, often do well. They're in the top. In the bottom, we find countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Burundi, Togo. The interesting part is to understand what factors explain the differences between those countries. And we can actually explain the variance, or 75% of the variance, with 6 factors. GDP per capita, money matters because being without money is a cause of unhappiness. Healthy life expectancy, I'll get back to that. Freedom to make life decisions. Freedom from corruption, so good governance. Altruism is the 5th one, or generosity. And then the last one is social support. So do we have somebody in our network, in our lives, that we can rely on in times of need? Those 6 factors explain the majority of the difference between the countries. Now, you could all have guessed health matters to happiness. And we see that in the data. But what I also find interesting is how much health matters, or how much diseases matters. And we've tried to map that together with a partner called Leo Innovation Lab. We've done a study that now have 85,000 patients in 15, 20 countries around the world. Now, psoriasis is a skin disease that is relatively common. It causes flare-ups, itchiness, bleeding, but there's also in some countries a sort of social stigma attached to skin diseases. What we try to understand is how much does this disease impact life satisfaction and other different dimensions of happiness in different countries. And what we find in the first round of data is that people with this disease in Denmark are 12% less happy than the average Dane. That's perhaps unsurprising. You get a disease, you are less happy. But I think what is surprising is that that happiness gap varies between the different countries. In the first round of results, we found that that happiness gap, the same disease, was 20% in the US. And it's the gaps I think is interesting. Those are the ones that we want to understand, not just when it comes to diseases, but for instance, for different policies. I mentioned the 6 factors before, those that explain why some countries do better than others. And it's part of the reason why the Nordic countries often do well in the happiness rankings. But I think there's also some additional factors when it goes for the Nordic countries in particular. And I think the first one is that the Nordic countries are really great at reducing extreme unhappiness, in part because of social security, access to universal healthcare, unemployment benefits, and so on. I think what happens in the Nordic countries is they're really good at reducing extreme unhappiness, so they elevate the bottom, and that raises the average, and these rankings are based on averages. So that's why they come out on top. So you can say that Denmark and Norway and Finland and Sweden and Iceland are among the happiest in the world. I like to say that they're the least unhappy, because I think that's actually better what is reflected in the data. The second reason why I think they also do well is that they, to some extent, remove the price tag there is on happiness. Basically, let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. So right now I have a job, and every day I cycle to work because there's a lot of investment in cycle infrastructure in Copenhagen. I could afford a car, but it's easier for me to get to work on a bike. This summer, one of my favorite activities after work is going to be to go down to the harbor where the water had been cleaned so I could swim after work. If I lost my job tomorrow, I would still be able to cycle everywhere I need to go, and I would still be able to enjoy swimming in the harbor. So my happiness is not dependent on my paycheck. And I think that's also what works in the Nordic countries. Another example was last year, I was in Kuala Lumpur, and I saw on the map that 300 meters from my hotel was the botanical gardens. So I thought, okay, I'll go over there. But halfway, I gave up. Because despite having millions and billions of dollars being invested in infrastructure, it was infrastructure for cars. They left out pedestrians, they left out cyclists. And what you're basically telling people with that investment strategy is that if you don't own a car, you are a second-rate citizen. You need a car not only to get mobility, but also to get dignity. And I think if we remove that, then it creates a society where there's less competition, there's less to compete for, and there's basically a higher level of quality of life for all. And that gets me to the third point. I think what works in the Nordic countries is that there is a relatively good understanding that my happiness also depends on SIF's happiness. That there is an investment in the common good, and that people don't think of taxes necessarily only as a bad thing and as taxes, but as investments in quality of life. We pay some of the highest tax rates in the world. I pay 52% of my income in tax, but I, together with 88% of Danes, say we're happily paying our taxes. And I think it's because there is this notion that we get a lot of quality of life in return. And I think when it comes to what we can learn from the Nordic countries is an understanding of how we become better at converting wealth into well-being. I think that's the key challenge for countries, cities, and individuals these years. I think a lot of us are feeling that we have gotten richer without necessarily getting happier. And I see more and more people and countries struggling with converting that wealth they've generated into well-being. I think South Korea is actually the poster child of that challenge and that feeling. As you know, South Korea have had this tremendous growth over the past 2 generations, gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest. And what they've done in terms of wealth creation is amazing. Unfortunately, they are really struggling with converting that into quality of life. They have the highest suicide rate in OECD. They have talent leaving the country to find a better work-life balance, basically to have dinner with their families, as some of them told me. Interestingly, it's also the country I get most visits from at the Happiness Research Institute. So they are really curious to find new ways of developing their country. And I think that's a good thing. And I think maybe I'll leave it to that, so we can go to questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike. So the lights are up, and I hope you have your questions at the ready. Otherwise, I'm going to use my prerogative to get in there first as moderator. We've got a question over there. Yeah. You just want to say who you are before asking your question.
Hello, Brendan, students from the UK. So you mentioned about the case of North Korea.
South Korea.
Oh, sorry, South Korea. Wow, they're pretty
different happiness levels.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but I think it represents the case of many Asian countries. So I'm just wondering, as in you mentioned about that country, and I'm pretty sure like the people there are pretty well off. As in, you say the Nordic countries, they use the tax as a means to help people to transform the wealth into well-being. So is it replicable for these Asian countries to do the same thing? Thank you.
I think it is, but I think it's one tool in a wider toolbox. I think for a lot of Asian countries, there's also a challenge with the education system. What I see is there is a lot of pressure on the young generation. There's a lot of pressure in all countries on the young generation, but I think especially in the case of South Korea, Japan, Singapore, there is a system that somewhat creates a feeling of competition over cooperation. You have systems that at a very early age rank the students against each other. And I think you have a system that at a young age teaches our kids that to some extent happiness is a zero-sum game, that you have an arms race when it comes to education, you'll have an arms race when it comes to money and jobs, you'll have an arms race when it comes to beauty. And I think it's also quite saying, I think it's in South Korea, they have a proverb that goes, if one cousin buys land, the other cousin gets a stomachache. And I think, you know, the taxation system is part of the tools, but I think we need also to work with what kind of values we work with in the education system, for one thing. Yeah.
Got a question over there?
My name is Peter Nichols from New Zealand. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Could you talk about whether there are some cultures or societies that are, for whatever reason, inherently more happy than others, and perhaps the South Korean and European context might shed some light on that?
Yeah. I think there are a lot we can learn, and when I say we, also the Nordic countries. I think it's very important to say that the Nordic countries or Denmark does not have a monopoly on happiness, and I think we are seeing pockets of happiness around the world. We see people, cities, ideas that are creating good conditions for quality of life. To give you one concrete sort of low tech, low practical example, I see more and more people take their streets and turn them into communities. There is a great case from Perth in Western Australia, where this woman, Shani, has basically taken her street and turned it into a community by getting people to start dreaming what their street could be like, and started to facilitate relationships between the neighbors, starting going around, finding out what kind of skills do people have, what kind of things are people needing. And suddenly she realized, okay, 3 people on the streets would like to sing, and we have an ex-choir mistress. And suddenly they form the Holbert Street Choir. And that generates a community that leads to what has eventually been pizza nights on Thursday, movie nights, and sort of a shared sense of community and a increased sense of belonging among those neighbors. I think those are fascinating cases that even the Nordic countries could learn from.
Got a few more questions here and here. Can I ask a skeptic's question, though? So apologies to the audience for jumping in. Look, so I deal with generations and intergenerational justice. And so not so long ago on a TV program talking about how younger people were basically sort of priced out in housing and suffering in terms of jobs, and actually wages hadn't gone up for that generation, which is the first time in 150 years. And it's something repeated in both America and other countries, and other Western countries. The response was, well, look, you've got iPhones. What's your problem? Shouldn't you be happy? And how does your field then actually sort of, when we're talking about rich Western nations, then get to grips with a phenomena which is sort of, in that sense, intergenerational, where you've got a generation of people coming behind who are actually going to be poorer than their parents, financially speaking, but might actually be happier? Isn't that awkward? And it's like saying, well, look, peasants in the Middle Ages could have been really happy.
Right.
So what's the issue on your scale then, right? How do you draw a difference?
Okay, so there are different issues here. If we take age and happiness, what we usually see is a U-shaped curve. So people are usually happiest when they're young and when they're old. So mid-40s is when they reach sort of rock bottom.
Yeah, I'm feeling it.
I'm
35, by the way. I just,
The trouble with that is that it's not a cohort study. So it might not be an age thing, it might be a generational thing. So that's one of the issues. And yes, the young generation might have iPhones, but iPhones are also an extremely efficient tool for you to feel bad about yourself. Every time you go to Facebook, somebody just ran an Ironman and getting married and all on the same day. And what we find, especially when it comes to income, is that people, yes, they care about absolute income, so our ability to consume stuff, but we care a lot about relative income. So how much money do I make compared to SIF? That's what seems to matter to people. And that's also why, even though we're getting richer, we might necessarily not be getting happier, because if we both double our income and you make more before, you still make more than I do. Because we care about our position in the social hierarchy. And that is also one of the issues, for example, with an economy like South Korea that have had this tremendous increase. But if the entire population is not keeping up, usually before what we saw when we got richer was there was an elevator effect. Right? We still had rich and poor, but we rose and fell together. I think what is happening now is the richer are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And I think what happened in the US in November, what happened with Brexit, what happens also in a lot of European countries with the rise of the extreme right, is a product of an increase in well-being inequality. That's going to be one of the new things in happiness research, that we start to look at happiness gaps, inequalities. If we take Brexit, if you looked at the counties that voted to leave the EU, income equality or income inequality could not explain that. But if we take well-being inequality, so the counties where there was a big gap between those that were happy and unhappy, those counties were more inclined to vote to leave. And I think that is super interesting.
Gentleman over here.
Australia. A recent study, and if my take-home message is correct, was that you couldn't be happy by doing things for other people, but you probably couldn't be happy if you didn't. So it's the double negative that you talked about with your least unhappy. Does that double negative apply to the other two characteristics? You had purpose, well-being, and there are three of them. Or is there much of that double negative in your happiness work?
I'm not sure I concur with that study. What we see in the data is that people who volunteer, who do good for others, are happier. Part of that is the reverse causality, right? If you are happy, you're probably more inclined to do volunteer work. But when we follow people over time, we also see that there is some benefits on life satisfaction and the positive emotions through volunteer work. One reason is that it strengthens our sense of community and our social relationships. We find friends through volunteer work. Another reason is that some kinds of volunteer work also exposes us to how people that are challenged live. So instead of Facebook, where we get all the great news from all our friends, suddenly we get an input on how things could also look, and perhaps that makes us more grateful of what we have. So I'm not sure. I haven't seen that study, so I haven't dived into it. I'm gonna look more into it. I can hear. Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one last short, sharp question, and then we have to wrap up. Go ahead.
Hello, my name's Una Van Dawson from the UK. I've read quite often that France is coming very low on the happiness indicators, and yet, you know, it's such a beautiful country with a great infrastructure, and I don't really, I mean, seriously low, like below Afghanistan sometimes. I wondered why.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, they rank relatively low, not lower than Afghanistan though, but yeah. But it is actually known as the French unhappiness puzzle. Because if you look at those 6 factors we talked about before, they're actually doing well on those 6 factors. And there are a couple of studies that try to explain that. One is from Claudia Senig, who's a French economist at the Paris School of Economics. Her explanation is that it's the academic or the education system. I'm not familiar with the French education system, but I understand that at a young age, pupils are also ranked in terms of their skills in math and French and so on. And her theory is that if you are at a young age exposed to that dimension of social comparisons, it's something you internalize and take with you later in life. So that mechanism we have of constantly comparing ourselves to each other is perhaps something that is stronger among the French. Other people say that the French are unhappy because we like to complain. But I hear the same in Portugal, I hear the same in Latvia, and I also hear Danes say we love to complain. So maybe it's not a French thing or a Portuguese thing. I think the love of complaining is a human thing.
Mike, thank you so much. I think we have to leave it there. Thank you so much. We could also thank all the staff who made today possible and put the events, all 8 of them, on today. Thank you. And all that's left for me to say is enjoy tomorrow.